Welcome to another episode of the Music Teachers in International Schools podcast. I'm your host, Chris Cormer. And this community and podcast aims to cut through the geographic and curricular isolation, sounds quite fancy, that many of us feel and draw a community of like-minded international music educators together to share, learn and connect. So thank you to those who have recently joined our bi-weekly newsletter, which if you haven't done so already, you can sign up for at MTIIS.co. And each fortnight, the newsletter contains 3 quick things. The podcast, a professional learning opportunity, and an international school-specific music education resource. So today I'm speaking with Kirrili Williams. Kirrili is a long-time member of the MTIIS community and previously led music teams in international schools in Australia, the UK, Oman and China. And Kirrili recently completed a master's degree in international education, looking at the effects of the pandemic in international schools in China. And she's now currently in Australia teaching music education to pre-service primary teachers and is the director of Paperbark Publishing, a website that delivers a range of resources for teachers working on the IGCSE and CIE A-level music curriculum. So, since I'm currently based in Australia, I made the trip up the coast to catch up with Kirrili in person. So Kirrili, welcome to the show and thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Chris. It's so nice to be here. We're in this beautiful setting in this lovely farmhouse and Chris has assured me that he knows the people who live in the house. So.
Yeah, it's an amazing farm. We've just been kind of doing a little tour of it and it's absolutely beautiful. So we might have to do some kind of MTIIS retreat here one day or something. Okay, so Kirrili, again, thanks for joining me. And as usual, I like to start with a bit of context. So can you tell us a bit about your background as a musician and a music educator?
Well, I originally trained as a piano teacher, actually. So I did an undergraduate degree majoring in piano pedagogy and my minor was psychology. And after graduating, I worked in a music school teaching group and individual piano and musicianship. And then I set up a business in Eastern Sydney, teaching mostly younger children, sort of up to about age 9. And I did that for about 7 years, I suppose. And that was a wonderful experience. It was a really, really sharp learning curve, but something I'm still grateful for at this age. And I sold that business and moved to the UK. And when I got to the UK, I had an opportunity to apply for a position in a school. And being a school teacher wasn't something that I was ever interested in because I always viewed it as being bureaucratic and spending a lot of time on things that weren't teaching and learning, and I had politics and hassles from parents and all of those things that did turn out to be true, I have to say. But when I got there, I realised that there were all of these other opportunities that were open to me. So I got to work with bands and orchestras and choirs. I got into arranging music, which has always been an interest of mine. And so after doing that for a few years, I got formally qualified. The system in the UK was a little bit different then. And came back to Australia, worked in various schools there, and then eventually thought it was time to sort of continue in the international adventure. And my children and I spent 6 years in Oman and China after that, and just come back a few months ago and kind of back in the country really for family reasons at the moment, but busy already.
We're going to get into a bit more about what you're sort of doing now. But before we go there, you sort of mentioned you felt like a bit of an adventure, I guess. What was the catalyst that brought you to international school teaching? Was there a particular thing that you sort of thought, I need to go and work in Oman?
I think I've always been a little bit of an adventurer. I'm someone who likes to be in new situations, and I'm one of those people that sort of like to do things where I'm 80% sure that I know what I'm doing. So I'd been a little bit of a traveller already. I'd worked in the UK, which is not really a particularly foreign environment, but I found there were a lot of things there that I had to learn that were very, very different to Australia in terms of culture and education. So it was a case of just waiting for the opportunity to come up, really. And then the family had sort of hit a stage where we're sort of looking at the next thing to do. And then Oman came up, and I had to check the map to see if it was where I thought it was. And it was almost where I thought it was. And my children were really keen for the adventure. So for me, it was a case of being able to go somewhere new and experience relationships with people who lived in a really different way to what we did. And as a mum, that was something that I really wanted for my own children. And I think for both of them it was really beneficial. And if I had any regrets so far, it would be that I didn't take them sooner and that we didn't do that when they were even younger. Because I think in terms of language, younger children fare really, really well in international settings, especially somewhere like China, where picking up the local language is so important.
Yeah. This has come up a fair bit on the podcast. Individuals with families saying that it's been such a valuable thing for their children. So
there's a lot to think about, and as children get older, there are a lot more factors. But for young children, I would say if you've got young children, go and do it. Do it now. Do it now.
So as I said in the introduction, you've worked in a whole bunch of places, and you've reiterated that. And I guess we've spoken about the different curricula that you've worked with, the Australian style, British style, IB. How would you describe your approach to music teaching? Let's go to music teaching straight away, with all of these influences. I
think with different systems, it's really easy to get swayed into a certain way of teaching when you're working in a particular system. And it's confusing for teachers who were sort of doing this and then all of a sudden they're doing this. And so if you're working with something that's quite content-led, the British curriculum I think is probably a good example there. You're working with assessment systems that are based on a lot of writing. There are essays, there are set works to consider. It's very easy to lock yourself into a teaching style where you are sitting at desks, you're doing a lot of writing, you're listening to recordings, that sort of thing, which of course is very essential. But you need to make space for those other learning experiences as well. You need to take ideas from the works that you're studying and you need to compose with those ideas. You need to factor all of those creative things into that process. And by the same token, if you're working with something that's maybe a bit more process-led, so the MYP is probably a good example of that, you can get maybe a little bit too distracted by analysing the processes and how the processes have gone and maybe forget a little bit about the content, and you've gone down a rabbit hole of reflecting on how your group has been working, and then after 6 months you still maybe don't understand sonata forms. So I think a good teacher doesn't go back and forth between different teaching styles too much. A good teacher puts together all of these different ways of approaching the material and then is able to shift their focus a little bit when they're moving from one system to another.
Yeah, that's a nice way to put it. And I was reflecting on my conversation with Jana Beidun from last week, who... That's
a great example, actually, and there's somebody who's got that experience and has worked out how to sort of to use that experience and not throw the baby out with the bathwater, I think, yeah.
Yeah, that's a good analogy. Okay, so in your various roles, you've been a director of music, working with teams. So what, in your experience, has been the most challenging thing about the director of music role?
There are a lot of challenges with the director of music role, and I think it's quite different in every school. So it's probably hard to pick the biggest one, but I'll give you the first big challenge that I think I encountered and was a bit of a surprise to me, is that I realised quite early on that you really spend as much time talking about what you're doing as you do actually doing it. And there's a lot of self-promotion. And when I say self, I don't mean self, I mean the department and the students and what you're doing. And you're constantly proving to school management that they're getting bang for their buck. You're constantly showcasing things to parents. And that can be quite frustrating at times because you're not actually engaging in teaching and learning. You're talking about it, you're displaying photos of it, you're writing for school newsletters, you're making connections in the community, you're out, the other faculties in your school personally inviting your colleagues to your events, that sort of thing. So I think you have to understand that frustration and expect it, but you also have to embrace it as well. I think it's actually a really important part of the job that people understand what you're doing, and can see the visible benefits of it. And
so with all of your, I guess, various influences coming into your background, I'm thinking you've got these teams of diverse people coming in different contexts, cultural contexts, Oman, Australia, UK, China. How did you find, or what approaches did you use to sort of marry together your experience with those in your team that might come with really different experiences as well?
I think you've actually just touched on one of the biggest problems in international music teaching is that people come from different contexts, and you have this in any local system. You have people who play different instruments who've learnt in specific ways, but when you go into that internationally, the difference is sometimes really vast. Then you add to that this layer of complexity that people generally tend to work on fairly short contracts. So a teaching contract is usually 2 years, and that gets renewed in my research, gets renewed about 50% of the time. So a long period for an international teacher might be 6 or 7 years. It's really not very long. So you have this constant turnover. So one of the things that I think is really important is having a consistency in your curriculum. And one of the problems in international schooling generally is that people come in and they call it the suitcase curriculum. They put something in and then that person leaves and that curriculum goes with them, and then, again, throwing the baby out with the bathwater, So having that consistency that people can lock into and then contribute to is really important. But I think it's an issue. I think it's a problem that everyone in a music department working internationally has to face.
Okay, so if there is a teacher maybe or a leader listening to this podcast and they're thinking, I'm really struggling with this. I've had teachers come and go. I've got all these people with different approaches to music education. What would be your top tips for supporting someone in that situation?
Okay, it is a hard one, but I'd say one of the first things is try and get some clarity and some consistency from your school leadership. So quite often, not all the time, but quite often your school leadership will have a vision of what they want for the music department. So they might be more focused on academic results. They might want your music department to be pushing those grades that get those children into university. They might see your music department more as a marketing tool. And of course, there'll be all of these factors everywhere, but school leadership will always have a different slant. So if you can get on the same page as your school leadership, then you've got something to harness your department to. Now, sometimes that's really easy, and sometimes you wonder if your school leadership even have a book in front of them, let alone whether on a page. So, but if you can manage that, if you can have those conversations, then that's probably the first thing. And I think the other thing is too that you need to choose your battles and work out what you're going to stick with and what you're going to argue and what is really important and what you need to sort of relent on. You can't argue on everything. You'll never get anything done, and you're just going to cause disharmony in your department, which is never a good thing for anybody. So I'll give you an example. Before I taught in China, my previous 4 schools before that all had systems of using movable dough methods. And 2 of them had really established systems that I actually learnt a lot from. My department in Oman, or I should say our department in Oman, and hi Eric if you're watching, we made a decision in that department to bring in those methods, and it was really successful. And I'm a proponent, of those teaching methods. I think they work. They've done a lot for me musically. When I got to China, I realised that instrumental teaching in China works on a fixed-dose method. And so I was looking out into a country of 1.4 billion people and a lot of instrumentalists in there as well, and working with a system that was basically incompatible with what I'd been doing for many years prior to that.
Wow.
So even though that was something that I personally believed in, I'd seen results from, and was something that I wanted to continue with my own development, there was no point in me arguing that. You know, there's a very, very established system in that country already, and me sort of coming in as one individual trying to implement what I thought would work, what I thought was the most efficient way of doing things, was not going to have any impact and was just going to confuse students. So that was something that I had to let go for a bit, because in that context it wasn't going to work.
No, that's such a good example. I'm just trying to think of any other examples that might crop up where a teacher might rock up at a school and there's this established program and they just can't push their agenda. They might have to be flexible, like you said.
Yeah, it's a hard one, because we're all on a journey. We're all developing our own musicianship. We're all developing our ways of teaching, and internationally, you have to be prepared to take a bit of a zigzag, I think.
Yeah.
And as I said, you have to really sit down and think which things are worth pushing, and which things are maybe perhaps a bit egotistical to pursue and not in the best interest of the students or the department.
There's some great research that this is reminding me of on musical identities and how we generally carry these musical identities with us wherever we go. And they can be identities from our upbringing, they can be things we've established along the way, but that's really hard to think I'm going to potentially go to a school where I have this identity that I might have to shift, or I might have to try and really move across to accommodate the context. I'd love to hear from anyone else in the community that might have had this kind of experience where you've rocked up at a school and you've really had to shift something. So from your experience then in these different contexts, and like you said, with this idea of being flexible, maybe this is a good way to prompt us into my favorite question, which is, what do you think then makes a good international school music teacher?
Okay, so there are a lot of things that make a good music teacher, and of course they're all applicable. So I think, being able to meet students at their level, being able to work with students with whatever experience they've got, being able to deliver authentic practical experiences, I think is a really important part of being a music teacher. The ability to be able to teach musicianship, I think, in a really systematic way, I think is important. And I guess the ability to continue on your own musical journey, to continue to develop your own skills, I think is important, because it gives you more things to teach with, but it's also putting you forward as a role model as well, somebody who's still learning themselves. I remember someone saying once to me, you don't want to let the students see you practicing. And I had that expression. I thought, why not? And this colleague, who was a great colleague and a great teacher, he said to me, I think you need to sort of maintain some of the magic that you can just you do it. And I said, no. I think the students need to see that I can't just do it. I have to work at it as well. And if I'm going to improve my skills, then I need to get in there and practice as well. So they're the things that make a good music teacher. And then when you put that into an international context, I think you've got some other things that are not as important in a local context. So one of them would be able to plan on the fly, because in a local situation, you've got a calendar that of course changes, but it's much more consistent, and generally you've got a lot more time to work with what's coming up. So the international system, your school can change like that with a change of leadership, a change of clientele. It can be unrecognisable after 2 or 3 years. Yeah. So you need to be able to do things at fairly short notice, I think. And over the years, I started to collect a go-to folder of music that I knew reasonably well, that had been successful in the past, was good for certain events. So when somebody came to me and said, look, can you pull this together in 4 weeks? And I'd go, rather than sort of going through YouTube or all my dusty manuscripts, and that's all fun, but sometimes you don't have time for that. I would go to the folder.
This is such a great idea, because we often hear this, I guess it's an issue, of teachers saying, oh, I just get this thing thrown on me at the last minute all the time. But you're here saying, kind of embrace it. Like, be prepared if you can in a flexible kind of way again. But having that folder of ideas, whether it's on the computer or physically, such a good point.
Yeah, well, that comes to my next point, actually, which is you have to be prepared to say yes, I think 95% of the time. So you can't back away from things that are a little bit daunting or a bit outside your experience. But there are also times where if something is completely outside your level of expertise or something you know is not going to work, you also have to be prepared to say no, I think. And I can only think of probably 2 occasions in my career where I've said no. I don't think that's a good idea and I'm not prepared to do it. I think on the whole you have to be willing to give things a go at short notice, but you have to know where the line is as well. There's a lot of marketing, there's a lot of pure marketing in international schools. So even in local schools, big private schools with huge budgets, there's a lot of marketing there, but there's more of an opportunity to incorporate learning experiences into them, I think. So if your school fair coming up and they're going to expect the band to play, then that's great. But if you know the band are going to be playing in October, then you can incorporate a learning experience for them. You can give them the repertoire that they need in order to learn what they need to learn, and then you can go out and have all the photos and everything done as well. I think in international schools, sometimes you have to accept that there'll be a couple of occasions where you are just marketing, and you don't have the time or the resources to be as good an educator as you'd like to be in that context. And the other thing I think is to be able to get a new curriculum and pull the bones out of it. Just get the important stuff to be able to teach it straight away. Again, in a local context, you might teach the same program for 17 years. So if you're, and that will change, that will evolve, that will hopefully improve as you go through. But if your first 2 years of teaching are maybe not very successful in the general scheme of things, that's not such a big deal. But if you've got 2 years teaching MYP and then you're moving on to GCSE after that, that's it. If you don't have it together in those 2 years, then you've kind of blown your opportunity. So you need to be able to jump into a new system, work out what the important stuff is, to be able to make sure that all of that stuff is covered and not get bogged down in things that aren't important or aren't that relevant in that system.
I really like all of your answers. Very deep as well. Some good depth there. Okay, we're going to pivot a little bit because in the intro I mentioned your master's degree, which sounds like it's diversified a lot from when you actually did the degree, which we may or may not go into. But I wanted to ask more about why you decided to do a master's degree and why it might be a good idea for people in our community to consider doing something like that, and what might be some of the challenges of doing a master's degree. I
think for me, like everybody, I'm a music teacher, I'm a musician, but I'm many other things as well. I'm interested in education and in a broad sense. I'm a business owner, I'm, lots of things. I studied psychology, all of these things. So for me, doing the master's was an opportunity to kind of formalise a lot of other things, I think. And in that sense, it was really satisfying. I was looking at school management much more broadly than, creative arts faculty. And I tried to look at how it worked in a whole country, and a big country at that. So that research and sort of having all of that sort of surrounding me opened up a lot of conversations outside my area of expertise, which is music education. And that's been fantastic. So as a result of that, I started writing for School Management Plus and doing webinars for them on broader education issues. It's put me in contact with a lot of people across the world, but particularly in China, who were interested in these things. And so it's enabled me to sort of get out of one of those boxes that I think get created for people in the creative arts. I think it's a bit of a trap, and I think for people in sport too, they have the things. So in that respect, it was really satisfying. I would say that Sydney University is a pretty grueling institution in terms of their demands of workload, and but I'm also a person that likes learning for learning's sake. So I'm really grateful for that. If people are considering, though, doing a master's, I would say go for it. It's really, really interesting stuff. There are 1,000 different topics that you could get into, and that's one of the really hard things. But you do need to think about how you're going to find time to complete it.
Yeah.
I had a fairly long-term plan with mine. I worked very, very gradually, but I'd investigated that before I started. So I'd be looking at courses, how long do I have to take to complete the course? Can I take breaks, which I did? Are the units flexible? That sort of thing. Trying to line your working calendar up with your study calendar is, sometimes it works really well and sometimes it's an absolute nightmare. Who's going to pay for it is another thing. It can be really, really expensive. So there are a lot of things to consider, but it's an experience that I definitely recommend, I think.
And from that master's, as you said, it's really connected you with people outside your bubble. And coming up in July, you're going to be presenting something loosely, but definitely connected to your research at the Australian Society of Music Educators Conference, which is something that for me has certainly done as well, connected me to sort of an academic world, which is really kind of interesting. So tell us a bit about that. What are you presenting on? And take it sort of as deep as you want.
Okay, so this is another example of sort of connecting with those other things that we do outside of music education. So as I mentioned before, my minor study when I was an undergraduate was psychology. And so naturally I'm very interested in educational psychology and music psychology, and I'm sure you're aware, and everyone listening to this is aware, that at the moment we have a huge increase in the numbers of young people being diagnosed with anxiety disorders. And one of the things that I've learnt recently, particularly talking to clinical psychologists, is that gap between having normal anxious feelings or being a bit worried about something that's coming up or whatever, which is a very natural part of human existence, and developing a full-blown anxiety disorder that requires treatment, that gap is becoming shorter. So that slope is becoming steeper and things are happening a lot more quickly. And one of the reasons that psychologists have identified for this are things that are called accommodating behaviours. So things that significant adults put into place with the intention of making life easier for the child that they're looking after, but unintentionally actually making their anxiety worse. And what that often comes down to is young people avoiding situations and not engaging with them, and therefore not building up that toolbox of being able to deal with having normal anxious feelings. And so how does that relate to music education? And I can hear music teachers out there sort of all saying, now we know this, we know this, So music teachers have dealt with normal anxious feelings with young people since time began. That's something that we do naturally, and it's something that we factor into our teaching very deliberately. So of course, the obvious example here is performance anxiety. Most people get performance anxiety. Most musicians get some level of performance anxiety at some point. And of course, that differs a lot from individual to individual. But teachers, any music teacher worth their salt, factors that in from the beginning. And they how many instrumental teachers do you know who line up teddy bears, to be a practice audience for a 6-year-old who is about to do their first recital, who get somebody to just come and listen to you playing the exposition. Let's just play that for somebody. I used to play games with my piano students where I would get them to play, and the game was I had to distract them. So I'd be banging on the end of the piano, doing silly dances around the room, making stupid noises, noises, and that's what music teachers do. And music teachers sort of build in those tools. They scaffold the experiences. They choose repertoire that's appropriate, that's very much the next level. And this is something that I'm a little bit worried is under threat. So one of the things I'm looking at is what impact does this increase in anxiety disorders have on music education, and what impact is it likely to have in the future? So that's an important point, I think. But the other thing I think is that I think music teachers are ahead of the curve, and we've got a lot to share. We've got a lot to share with how we approach things and how we build that. I don't want to say resilience because I think it's a really overused word at the moment. So, how we build that ability of young people to have a go at something that's a bit tricky or a little bit challenging. Because I know from experience that if you've gone from shaking like a leaf and not being able to see 10 centimetres in front of you, and I can tell you I've been there. I've had the worst symptoms of that when I was younger, but once you've managed that and you've played an instrument in front of 3,000 people and you've enjoyed it, you feel like you can do anything. And this is not about music anymore. This is about being able to tackle life's challenges. And I don't want young people to miss out on that. So this is what we're going to be talking about at ASME. I think it's going to be a big discussion, but I'm really looking forward to it.
That is so exciting. So again, ASME is the Australian Society of Music Educators Conference, and I'm anticipating this being something that you're going to look at for some time. It sounds amazing, and I think our community would love to hear more about it. Is there any way that you think we could hear more about it in the future? Are you going to write about it? Are you going to be talking more about this concept?
Look, this stuff is all over my kitchen table at the moment, so I think I'd be very disappointed, I think, if the conversation stops at the conference. Yeah. I think, we're touching on things that really could hopefully go a long way to, really sort of improving things for young people in the future and education in general. So I certainly hope so. Yeah,
watch this space, and let's try and maybe do a follow-up conversation in a year's time or something and learn more about this. If anyone in the community has experience of this, or you have maybe even some good strategies like Kirrili mentioned, lining up the teddy bears, anything like that you want to share, please do, because it's something that we all, as Kirrili said, we all probably have go-to tricks that we've just always done, but it'd be nice to share them so we learn from each other. Brilliant. So there's one other thing I wanted to touch on today, and you mentioned earlier, you're a business person, you've done business sort of throughout your life, and I think, did we mention about your music school?
We did at the beginning, yes.
Great. That's my poor listening. But currently, we've got Kirrili working on this project, this company called Paperbark Publishing. Can you tell us more about what it is and what the resources offer for the MTIIS community? Sure,
yeah. Paperbark's a fairly small project. It's a bit of a niche project, but it was kind of born out of conversations with teachers who were going back to what we're talking about before, sort of having to jump into a new curriculum and say, right, what am I doing? How am I going to be prepared to walk into the room? And to start with, these were teachers of the Cambridge A-level music course. And as you probably know, that program has a 5-set works, and they rotate every 2 years. So you can imagine for teachers coming into that system, they need to get up to speed with 5 substantial pieces of music, and then they teach them, and then they're all out the window, and then the next lot come in. So and the conversations that I was hearing were teachers saying, oh, I know this one, I've taught this before, that's fine. That one will be fine. I know that composer, or I'm familiar with that style. I've got no idea what to do with this. I've never heard of this piece of music before. It's not a style I'm familiar with. I don't know where to start. It's going to take me ages. Do I have to do my own analysis? I can't find one, etc., etc. So we started providing analysis notes and individual notes for each work, not a whole pack for the whole course, but where teachers, or not teachers, because teachers don't pay for resources, schools do, where schools could purchase just what they needed. And then that started to grow because then we started to get requests for GCSE materials. So we started producing GCSE notes, and then we started to get requests for mock exams, which made perfect sense because mock exams are relatively easy to make, but they're very fiddly and finicky and they take a really long time. So why not sort of fill that gap and leave teachers to do what they do best, and not sitting there making sound files and setting things out on the page. It's a waste of time. So we're at the stage now where we've got the Cambridge courses really covered, and one of the best things about this project is that we hear from teachers and they tell us what they want, and it's funny because they often say, oh, look, this is a really long shot, or I'm really sorry to bother you and I know you're busy and yada yada, but I was just wondering if you're considering producing X, Y, Z. And I think, well, don't apologise for telling us what you need, because the whole point of this project is finding those gaps where teachers can't find what they need. So, as I said, we're kind of covered with Cambridge at the moment, and we're just starting to make a decision about where we focus on next. So we're hoping to get some feedback from teachers who are working to specific courses, and there's something there and they can't find it.
I didn't mention this at the beginning, but this is one of the ways that I got to know about Kirrili, because one of my team members back a while ago was struggling with this. They were looking for something to help them with the CIES that works, and I came across Paperbark Publishing and I was like, this is really cool, great. And then I think bought a couple of the resources for the department, and then later found out that it was Kirrili's project. So it is amazing stuff, and do check it out. It's all there. It's a pretty simple website that you can just jump on and navigate around and check out all the resources. And I guess a shout to the community, or a question to the community, if you have a particular British style curriculum resource that you need, let us know.
Or not even British style. No, anything.
Could be anything.
Yeah. So we've kind of identified the gaps we've started with British curriculum, but if there's something out there in another system that needs, a Samuel Wright's textbook on MYP. I mean, there's a great example of something that people were crying out for, and Samuel was able to say, oh, I can do this. I can provide this. So we're looking for the next thing, not necessarily in British curriculum, but if it happens to be EdExcel or something like that, then so be it. We'll look at it.
Great. Kirrili, thanks so much for exploring all these different topics. It was really nice, quite wide-ranging. Is there anything we missed that you wanted to share, to chat about?
I don't think we've missed anything, because we've covered probably every aspect of music education. We've covered a lot of things, but I think we've definitely started a lot of conversations today that hopefully we can follow up again a bit more in the future.
Well, all the best with everything that's ahead with the various projects, and yeah, look forward to catching up again for maybe a follow-up episode in a year or so.
Fabulous. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Music Teachers in International Schools podcast. Listen to other episodes by visiting MTIIS.com, or learn more about our community on Facebook by simply searching for Music Teachers in International Schools. If you know someone who you think I should get on the podcast, I'd love to hear from you. You can find me at chriskoelma.com, ChrisKoelma.com. See you next time.